May Day celebrations here in Berlin can be instructive about some of the issues at stake here. I mean, I know you lived here, Adam, for some time, and so I assume you're familiar with how the May Day looks here. But for those who haven't been in Berlin on a May Day, it's a day off where everyone sort of tends to gather outside. The weather's usually nice, and there's some sort of political kind of protests, usually intermingled with some kind of party atmosphere. But then, as the sun starts setting, this sort of really odd thing starts to happen. I mean, people start kind of going indoors, and then the sort of atmosphere starts to change, and it's this sort of very odd, almost ritual of violence that starts to take place on the streets, and it's understood. Everyone knows going in what's going to happen. And basically, there are sort of street battles between police and then these kinds of anarchist groups, anti-establishment groups of various kinds. And yeah, they sort of have at it, and then eventually it dies down, and then people go to work the next day. But this got me wondering what any of this has to do then at that point with kind of labor unions. I mean, again, this all started as kind of a Labor Day, and then all of a sudden it's sort of taken over by anarchists, and anarchists aren't exactly labor unions, right? I mean, in fact, I would guess that unions would see themselves as opposed to anarchists. I mean, unions are sort of institutions of their own, right? I mean, how to make sense of what's going on in Berlin on a day like this?
Well, the tradition is authentic to the extent that what we're commemorating on May Day is state violence against labour. So it's always double-edged, right? If it goes back to the Haymarket massacres, then it's fundamentally about the question of justice as well, and that is posed in different forms by the labour movement on the one hand and by anarchism on the other. But the microcosm of Berlin, and it's worth saying, it's one particular corner of West Berlin where this is really pronounced, and it's Kreuzberg, which is a former working class district up against what used to be the Wall, which had a large amount of abandoned, bombed out, semi-bombed out housing after the war that was not renovated because Berlin was a shrinking city, and these big apartment blocks were up against the tenements, really, in American sense, but large by American tenement standards. They were up against the wall, so they were very undesirable property. And what this meant was that in the anarchist leftist scene of the 70s and 80s in Germany, in West Germany, of which West Berlin was a weird appendage, that part of Kreuzberg became the home for a autonomous anarchist movement. Autonomous in this sense means that they were literally trying to challenge the authority of the state and the state's organs of authority, the police, over that part of the city. And this was a movement that developed in close conjunction with the anti-nuclear protests of the 1980s, which were very violently policed by the German authorities. And the anarchists set themselves to developing a counterforce, a self-protection unit, if you like. And they took to wearing a uniform, black because of it's the anarchist color, but a uniform also because it made it hard to identify the people who were involved. They would wear masks and a standard black kit. And so it was quite hard to figure out in trials who they were. And the tradition of violent clashes with the police in Kreuzberg goes back to 87. It's a specific year because this was the period of the anti-census mobilization. So there was typically, in a sense, also to a degree, anti-authoritarian, anti-state mobilization in West Germany against the census, which was regarded as a tool of state surveillance in an ominous tradition that went all the way back to Nazi Germany. And in the early morning of 1st of May 1987, the Berlin police made I think everyone felt was a deliberately provocative raid on the headquarters of the anti-census organization in Kreuzberg. And it was in the hours afterwards and the day that followed that the autonomist bloc, the Autonomen, the so-called Black Bloc, organized then on the flanks of the festival that was going on in the city. First of all, some sort of rather spontaneous acts of violence against police vehicles. And then by the evening of that day, full-on clashes. And to their mind, historic success that they gained is that the Berlin police withdrew from the eastern half of Kreuzberg, which is why SO36 becomes this legendary postcode for German counterculture. It's the scene of rap music of a certain kind, but also political militants. And a kid like me growing up in West Germany would make pilgrimage to SO36 because it was this freed zone for about 3 hours, and then the West Berlin police came back. But from that moment onwards, from that year onwards, May Day in Kreuzberg, in SO36 particularly, became this ritual that you observed, and people would literally, caravans would converge on Kreuzberg from all over Germany, because the Autonomen were a nationwide organization, semi-organization network to do battle with the police. And these continued all the way through. I think the last really serious, you're seeing the sort of afterburn of this, but the last really serious clashes were in 2008, 2010, where there were really large-scale clashes. One of the really interesting developments that's happened is, I mean, the autonomous bloc scene has dwindled very considerably. This whole culture has become somewhat old and stale. But the other thing that's happened is that the local authorities, local business community, the local police have become very smart in their, if you like, counterinsurgency tactics. And the key vehicle for this is a festival, which is known as Maifest, which is a clever English-German pun, because the German for May is Mai, but they spell it English, Myfest. So in other words, I own it. This is my neighborhood. I own it. It isn't the merchants of chaos and the anarchists that own this community. This is my party, and I'm going to have it. And they have very deliberately cultivated a giant street party focused on music, on culture, on food, on small businesses, and placed it slap bang in the middle of what used to be the riot zone. And cultivated it very directly. It sounds conspiratorial, but it literally has a name. It's called the aha concept, which again is a pun. Aha in German means kind of gotcha. I get it. I see the light bulb went off. And this was a strategy of urban policing which Berlin adopted from the late 1990s onwards, which means that they reach out, they engage with the community. Well, one of the really funniest police Twitter streams to follow around the world is the Berlin police Twitter, which is part of this concept of humanizing the police, making them seem like friendly neighborhood cops who rescue cats and deal with turned over garbage bins, and it's part of this effort to re-embed the police in neighborhoods which in Berlin had become very hostile to state power.
Can I ask whether you were in Berlin in that fateful first year of 1987? Where were you, or should I be picturing you on the barricades? Was a younger
not in
Adam
1987, but I vividly remembered visiting earlier in the 80s and going around that neighborhood, because it was the only big squatter scene, or apart from Hamburg, it was the other big squatter scene in notionally what was West Germany, and squatting in Germany was this hugely contentious issue, because it was a very fundamental infringement on private property rights, and it's not something the German state puts up with for very long, except under rather exceptional circumstances, and that was West Berlin. So yes, you would make, as a fashionable leftist youth growing up in sleepy provincial West Germany, or for that matter London, you would definitely make pilgrimage to SO36 for the scene. And it was, I mean, there were burned out cars on the street. I mean, anyone who knew the urban crisis of the United States from the late 60s onwards would think it incredibly tame. I mean, we're not talking the Bronx or the south side of Chicago or the north end of Philadelphia here. This is a very cutesy version of and a very politicized version of what in America, of course, is a far more acute, far more fundamental, far more deep-seated urban crisis.
Yeah, I have actually heard that analogy before. Like, that neighborhood is the Bronx of Germany,
silly.
and I say if this is your Bronx, then you're all doing okay.
I mean, that's the most gratuitous. Yeah, it's absurd.
Yeah. But I will be probably at the Maifest on May 1st. Probably also be going indoors before it gets too nasty out there. But yeah.